Welcome to this second in the series of how do we step up to the world's challenges. And in this dialogue, myself and Professor Peter Hawkins are going to unpack what are the major challenges that we face today. And then we're just going to explore what the interdependencies are that fit underneath all of those challenges.
Thank you, Giles. And let's start in these 7 challenges that we've now put up on the screen with perhaps the largest and the most difficult to address of all of them, the climate emergency. You know, we talked about Gregory Bateson in the first one, and he was talking about the forthcoming challenges of ecological crisis. But now we're actually living in the midst of it. It's not something in the future, and it's not something out there. It's something we're all part of, and it's here and now. We're already seeing the impact on sea levels. In the UK today, we've got the highest UV levels we've ever had because of ozone depletion. It's now upon us. It's having massive effects right around the world, and yet it's in some ways one of the hardest for people to think about and address, I think, Giles.
Yeah, so this climate emergency is unfolding now in varying ways. And as Peter said, it also overlaps, as all of these things do, with the general degradation of air, sea and soil. And some of these issues really are so wide that it's difficult for us to sort of bring them into our everyday consciousness. So soil has been degraded now for some years, and it's now getting to a really challenging place. And we know about sea degradation as well, plastic in the ocean. In many places, there's more plastics part per million than there are plankton, the food of the sea. And as Peter says, the air is now being degraded, not just in terms of carbon parts per million, but all sorts of pollutants. And this level of pollution and toxicity that we're creating also impacts loss of biodiversity. There's always a background rate of extinction in species on Earth, and yet at this time of immense creativity and abundance and diverse life forms, we are seeing a really rapid decline now of, some scientists say, up to 1,000 times faster than it should be as a direct result of human activity. And what we've also linked here is this link to monoculture and control. So monoculture in terms of how we approach our farming, our ways of organizing our businesses, our ways of running our educational system. A lot of this has got this sort of monoculture mindset, which is underpinned by a desire to control essentially the uncontrollable nature of life. What would you like to add in on that, Peter?
Yes, just to pause there and say that I think that the natural human response when we're faced with so many problems, like ones you just mentioned on air, sea, soil, is to see them as single items and then to try and problem solve them. And in doing that, so we've got problems with certain plagues of locusts, so we'll deal with that, and we'll bring in chemicals, and part of our solutions then become part of the deeper problem, because and that's, I think, is part of the monoculture and control issue, that when we're overwhelmed, we try and take charge and manage.
Yeah, and we saw this in part with what the challenges that we're facing today with pandemics, and how isolating and focusing in is actually a very important part of what makes us human. And yet when we just do that, we lose the interconnections and we can create problems elsewhere. I mean, rising mental health issues and distress is another key one, and how that interrelates with these, and how it interrelates. They all interrelate. You said in the first series about this relationship between the inner and the outer in the first video, and that is key, how we're creating dis-ease essentially in our outer worlds, and of course that's interrelated to the rising dis-ease that we have within our inner worlds. You probably find this in your work as well, don't you, Peter, in coaching?
Yeah, so for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago, the term eco-anxiety was seen as a psychological classification. And I would suggest we're all suffering either consciously or unconsciously from eco-anxiety. or from the overwhelm of the amount of data we take in, the amount of screen time, and the complexity of the world we humans have created.
Yeah.
And for the first time, I think I mentioned this to you, more young men between 16 and 40 are dying through suicide than dying from war or murders put together.
Yeah.
There's this enormous rise of, and I think that's not just with overwhelming, that's to do with how do you find meaning in the midst of all that is happening.
Yeah. And this is what
that takes us on to also, one of the other reactions that human beings get into is what my American friends would say hunkering down, which is retreating to what I can relate to, my family, my community, my people, and that phrase "my people" gets echoed, and that's where we get into divisions, us versus them.
Yeah.
Whether that's white versus black or Muslims versus Christians, we get into what you and I both refer to as othering. We make the problem created by the others, right? And we make them the problem and us the victims.
Yeah.
And that whole process of othering and both conscious and unconscious human bias and prejudice, it is an underlying thing that then makes solving some of these other issues more difficult.
Yes. And it's that pushing away, that separating of the inner and the outer, that objectification, that reducing down, that all comes from a way of thinking, as you say, that Bateson and others, Bergson, and many great thinkers throughout ages have noticed, is a tendency within us and has become really dominant in today's age. And it serves its purpose. But if we're not careful, we can find, as you said, within each of these segments, that desire to fix carbon parts per million, to fix the ozone, to fix the loss of biodiversity, to fix mental health or human prejudice or inequality in a narrow sense, rather than recognizing that what underpins these challenges is that narrowing mechanistic way of thinking. And we need to open up to life. We need to let go of that control, grasping, narrowing focus in order to bring in a different quality of being and knowing that enables us to see the interconnections and then bring solutions that aren't tainted with the same consciousness that created them in the first place.
Yeah, and just to mention the last of the sermon that's up there, the widening inequality. This is at all levels. Whether it's the inequality of an organization between what's earned by the person at the top and the person at the bottom, whether it's within country. We both live in a country where we've seen that the gap between the poorest in our society and the rich in our society get bigger and bigger. And in the world where a small number of people own more money and resources than many countries. And one of the things that makes that so clear is that today the rest of the world know what the richest are getting. And it's one lovely little story of the first of the summits around the ecology at Rio in 1992. Some of the poorer countries went to President Bush and they said, look, President Bush, it's unfair that you're expecting us to have the same carbon reductions as you are taking on in America and in Europe, because many of the goods that we produce that creates our pollution are being consumed in the West, not by us. And we're making these products for your way of life. And President Bush replied, the American way of life is not up for negotiation.
Well, I think
unless we could deal with privilege, and that with privilege comes responsibility, and the more privilege you have, the more responsibility you have, we're not going to address, unless we address that widening inequality, we're not going to come right round and address climate emergency or any of these other major issues.
Yes, I mean, what we're saying really is what underpins all of these segments is that sense of separateness that we create inside ourselves and through our relationships, whether it be with nature, with life, whether it be with other people that are different from us, whether rich or poor, black, white, male, female, or whether it be our own selves, our own sense of self, whether we are connecting more deeply with our own deeper sense of meaning and purpose, or whether we're getting caught up in our own dis-ease. And none of this is to judge the situation that we're in. We're in it. The point is that all of these situations are actually pointing to a certain direction of travel, an evolutionary path for us as human beings, which if we get caught up in the segments themselves, we don't always see. So by standing back and gaining perspective on the middle of this pie, human consciousness, we hope to create the space to be able to create the foundation for a next stage in how we deal with all of these issues.
And that, Giles, will be our next, the third in this series of videos. So thank you very much.